It has been 3 years since Russia's war in Ukraine began, a grim milestone that's now coinciding with some shocking diplomatic shifts in the United States' support of Ukraine. US President Donald Trump seems to have flipped the script this week, calling Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy a dictator and accusing Ukraine of starting the war. To help us make sense of it all, we have Andrea Chandler, Professor of Political Science at Carleton University, joining us now. Thanks so much for your time, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
Let me start by asking what you made of Trump's comments this week. How unusual, just to put it in context for us, how unusual is it, how unprecedented is it for the US to break away from its allies like this, its allies in Europe, which until recently included Ukraine?
I'm not sure it's unprecedented for Mr. Trump to make counterproductive statements about either his allies or the war. We certainly saw that in his first term as president. I think what I would say is that it's simply not helpful to the process of trying to achieve peace in Ukraine. I think one of NATO's greatest strengths, when it has been a very effective global actor in the past, has been its ability to project image of unity and consensus among its members. And so for the leader of its largest country to make statements that are counterproductive to NATO policy and to the stances of other members is not helpful, and in my view, simply sets the peace process back. And it's very disturbing to hear Mr. Trump say things that are inaccurate, such as the notion that Mr. Zelenskyy started the war. It was Russia that started the war. In fact, Russia started this conflict in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea 5 years before Mr. Zelenskyy was elected, and the all-out invasion of 2022 was launched by Russia unilaterally. So it would be helpful if the NATO allies could really stick to the facts, and Mr. Trump should be encouraged to do so too.
In fact, to your point, Zelenskyy says that these claims, some of which you mentioned, are Trump essentially parroting Putin's, line of disinformation, the claims about Zelenskyy being a dictator, about Ukraine starting the war, about the money that the US gave in military aid being funneled away from the war effort. How do we make sense of this? Is it disinformation? Can we say that?
I would call it disinformation. I say that I would call anything disinformation to be inaccurate statements made by somebody who really should know better. Nobody has more access to information than the President of the United States, and the facts about how the war began are very well documented. Zelenskyy is not a dictator. He was elected in a landslide in the presidential election of 2019, followed up by a majority in parliamentary records. And both Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin really ought to be, I think, envious of that kind of success at the ballot box.
And in the meantime, we've seen Trump and some of his representatives demanding a $500 billion share of Ukraine's critical minerals, and this, they say, is in return for US military assistance. What do you make of that?
It's a very odd position to take in the first place, because it sounds like it's demanding reparations from Ukraine. Reparations is something that typically is asked of a defeated government in a war who has surrendered and is asked to turn over materials in exchange for damage that was done to other member countries. That is not the case here. Ukraine has been defending itself on its own soil, and the whatever aid the United States has provided to Ukraine, and by the way, the United States is not alone. Many other countries have provided aid, including Canada. that aid has not been sort of a freebie or a handout. It's based on the assumption that Ukrainian security is essential for the security of Europe as a whole, and by extension for the security of North America, including the United States. So whatever aid the United States has provided, one has to look at the very sad cost that Ukrainians have paid with their lives in order to try to defend the eastern part of Europe from aggression.
What is the sense then that you have at this stage about how this plays out? Because I imagine a lot of it will depend on how Europe pushes back. They need to push back at the US in defense of Ukraine's interests. But should we assume at this stage that any outcome, at least from these US-Russia talks that seem to be, leaving Ukraine out of the picture, leaving European allies out of the picture, any outcome from these talks will involve Ukraine giving up some territory?
Well, I think that's certainly what Mr. Putin wants. But talks between the US and Russia about the future of Ukraine are simply that. They're simply talks between two countries. They are essentially meaningless unless Ukraine is involved and unless Ukraine's other partners are involved, because this isn't a game. Serious conversations need to happen about the movement of troops, about demarcation lines, about security guarantees. Those need to happen if there's going to be peace in Ukraine. And so there need to be serious discussions about logistics. This is a war that has been primarily fought on Ukrainian territory. So of course, they need to be involved. So it seems that bilateral talks between Russia and Ukraine, I mean, they're two sovereign nations. They can engage in whatever bilateral talks they want to, but it's not, them having talks does not mean that it's advancing an end to the war in Ukraine. And I would say it's doing the exact opposite.
In
It's
fact,
simply delaying
yeah.
the onset of serious negotiations.
We do have, leaders from Europe visiting the White House this week. We have the Polish president meeting Trump, and that'll be followed by France and the UK. So we will see where things land. But thanks so much for your time. That is Andrea Chandler, professor of political science at Carleton University.